Number 12. Peter. Also known as Simon, Simon, Peter, and Cephas, Peter was the leader of the 12 disciples. He came from the ancient fishing village of Bethsaida along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Bible often portrays Peter as gentle but firm and extremely loyal to Jesus, but he wasn't perfect. When Jesus was arrested, Peter was afraid for his life, so he disowned him to avoid persecution. As an uneducated man, Peter was untrained in Mosaic law and was a slow learner who repeatedly made mistakes. But when given the opportunity to prove himself, he showed that he was capable. When Jesus walked on water, Peter joined him. Peter witnessed numerous miracles, including the time Jesus brought a dead girl back to life. In the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, 2/3 of Rome burned down. The Emperor Nero blamed Christians and crucified Peter. He was crucified upside down because he felt unworthy of dying the same way as Jesus. Number 11. James, son of Zebedee. Also known as James the Greater, James, son of Zebedee, was one of Jesus' main disciples and one of 2 apostles named James. The Bible recounts how he and his brother and fellow disciple John asked Jesus if they should call down fire from heaven on a town that refused to show them hospitality. In the book of Mark, James asked Jesus if he and John could sit on either side of his throne and promised to follow him into martyrdom. As the only disciple whose martyrdom is recorded in the Bible, James died by the sword at the hands of King Herod, who most likely beheaded him. He's considered the first person to die for Jesus. According to tradition, James was a missionary to Spain and was buried there, but he died in Jerusalem during the very early days of the Christian Church. For centuries, Christians have traveled to his alleged burial place in northwestern Spain on an annual pilgrimage called the Camino de Santiago. Every year, around 300,000 people visit the shrine of St. James the Great in the city of Santiago de Compostela. Number 10. John, son of Zebedee. John, son of Zebedee, was the 3rd member of Jesus' inner circle of disciples and the brother of James the Greater. He's best known for a few key events mentioned in the Bible, including when he took Jesus' mother Mary into his home and cared for her. When news broke that Jesus' tomb was empty, John and Peter ran there together. John arrived first, and the pair were mystified by the pile of linens left behind, unaware that Jesus would rise. According to tradition, John was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. He died in 98 AD from old age. Before John's death, Peter had asked Jesus what would happen to John, saying, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus replied by more or less telling Peter that it was none of his business, leading the disciples to believe that John wouldn't die. But they were wrong, and it is now thought that Jesus meant there were different plans for John's death than everyone else's. Number 9. Andrew. Andrew was a fisherman and the first disciple that Jesus called to serve him. Although he wasn't one of the 3 main disciples, he was known as one of the disciples more closely attached to Jesus. Before that, Andrew was a disciple of Jesus' cousin John the Baptist. Andrew brought Peter to Jesus and told him that Jesus is the Messiah. Even though Peter typically gets all the credit for recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, this is just one example of how Andrew almost always came second to his brother in the scriptures. This was likely because he was either younger or considered less important than Peter. Andrew was crucified in 60 AD in the Greek city of Patras. According to the Acts of Andrew, he was bound to an X-shaped cross known as a St. Andrew's cross because, like Peter, he considered himself unworthy of dying the same way that Jesus died. He remained suspended for 3 days, preaching the entire time. Earlier texts described the crucifix used in Andrew's martyrdom as a traditional cross. In both versions of the story, he was bound rather than nailed. Number 8. Philip, the Apostle. Philip is only mentioned a handful of times in the New Testament. He's one of 4 men named Philip who are discussed throughout the Bible. To make matters even more confusing, early Bible readers often got all these Philips confused with one another. Very little is known about Philip the Apostle. Like Peter and Andrew, he was from the coastal town of Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee. The Bible describes some Greek men seeking Philip out because they want to see Jesus, suggesting that Philip may have spoken better Greek than his fellow disciples. He's best known for bringing Nathanael to Jesus in the book of John. Jesus tests Philip by asking him where to buy bread for a crowd of 5,000 hungry people. Later in the scripture, Philip asks Jesus to show them God the Father. Jesus responds, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." There are varying accounts of Philip's death, which likely happened around 80 AD. One claims that he died from natural causes, while other records suggest that Philip was stoned, beheaded, or crucified upside down. Number 7. Bartholomew. Not much is known about the apostle Bartholomew other than his name. He may have gone by another name and is closely associated with Philip in the Bible, suggesting that the two had a relationship of some sort. Some believe that Bartholomew was also Nathanael in the Gospel of John. There's an apostle named Nathanael who's closely associated with Philip, and Bartholomew isn't mentioned in John. But others disagree and think that Bartholomew and Nathanael were different people. Bartholomew was likely martyred like most of the other apostles, and there are a variety of claims about how he died. According to the most popular and gruesome version, he was flayed alive and then decapitated. Paintings depicting Bartholomew's death often show him cut up and wearing his skin or holding a flaying knife. Other accounts of Bartholomew's death suggest that he was beaten and crucified, crucified upside down, crucified, taken down while still alive, and then flayed and beheaded, beaten unconscious, and thrown into the sea, and that he was just beheaded. While the specifics surrounding Bartholomew's death are unclear due to the conflicting stories, it's clear that he didn't die from natural causes or from old age. However, he passed from this world. It was likely horrible. Which version of this story had you heard or believed to be true? Tell me in the comments. Number 6. Matthew. Also known as Levi, Matthew was a tax collector who collected money for Rome from fellow Jews in 1st century Judaism. This was one of the most criticized and hated professions, seen as a form of betrayal that represented Rome's occupation of Israel. So when Jesus asked Matthew to be one of his disciples, it showed that God chooses all sorts of people to do his work, including people who were normally considered outsiders. Matthew is only mentioned 7 times in the Bible, yet he's one of the most well-known disciples. According to the Gospels, Jesus approached him at a tax collector's booth and asked Matthew to follow him. The two then ate dinner at Matthew's house with many tax collectors and sinners. Jesus did this not as a demonstration of poor character but to show that even the people society considered irredeemable were accepted by God. The circumstances surrounding Matthew's death are largely a mystery. One account suggests that he died of old age, but it's more likely that he was martyred like most of his fellow disciples. There are various accounts of what may have happened to him, including stories about him being beheaded, stabbed, burned, or stoned. Number 5. Thomas. Thomas the Apostle isn't mentioned much in the Bible, and the details of his life are conflicting and obscure. But he became well known for his skepticism during one particularly famous event that earned him the nickname, Doubting Thomas. The Gospel of John describes how Thomas doubted Jesus' resurrection, stating to his fellow disciples, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Jesus appeared and offered to let Thomas touch his wounds like he said he needed to in order to believe that the resurrection was real. This story was the foundation of evidence-based faith and for the concept of, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Thomas was martyred on July 3 in 72 AD. According to tradition, he was speared to death in Mylapore, India. Unlike the accounts of most of the other disciples' deaths, there are only a few stories about how Thomas died, and they're all similar. Are you familiar with the Doubting Thomas story, and did you know its origin? Tell me in the comments, and while you're there, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Number 4. James, son of Alphaeus. In case you haven't noticed, James was a popular name during biblical times. The Apostle James, son of Alphaeus, is only mentioned in the 4 lists of the Apostles, meaning that only 2 things are known for sure about him: that his name was James and that his father's name was Alphaeus. There are numerous speculations about him, but none of them can be proven as facts. To make matters even more confusing, while it's clear that James, son of Alphaeus, was a different person than his fellow apostle James, son of Zebedee, there are 2 other people named James in the Bible. One of them is Jesus' brother, also known as James the Just, and the other is known as James the Less. It's unclear whether either of them is the same person as James, son of Alphaeus. Even the early church struggled with trying to figure this out. Because of all this confusion, it's hard to say how James, son of Alphaeus, died. Jesus' brother James met a violent end when he was pushed from a temple's pinnacle, beaten with a club, and then stoned to death. One account detailing the death of James, son of Alphaeus, claims that he was crucified during a preaching mission in Egypt. Another story says that he was stoned to death in Jerusalem. Regardless of how James the Apostle died, it's probably safe to say that he was martyred. Number 3. Jude, the Apostle. The Apostle Jude is known by several names, including Jude of James, Judas of James, Thaddeus, Judas Thaddeus, and Labius. Some people believe that he was Jesus' brother, but there are no clear statements in the Bible about this being the case, so nobody can say for sure whether both Judes were the same person. It's hard to speculate about Jude the Apostle's life or death without considering it as a possibility, however. Jude the Apostle was definitely a different person than Judas Iscariot, and it's believed that he went by the nickname Thaddeus to distinguish himself from Judas, who wasn't exactly a well-liked figure of the church during this time. Tradition holds that Jude the Apostle was martyred alongside Simon the Zealot in what is now the city of Beirut in 65 AD. At the time, the region was part of the Roman province of Syria. Religious artwork often depicts Jude holding an axe, which symbolizes how he died. One account claims that his remains were transported from Beirut to Rome in 1665 and were placed in a crypt at St. Peter's Basilica, where his bones share a tomb with Simon the Zealot. Another story claims that Jude's remains were preserved at an Armenian monastery in Kurdistan and that they were kept there at least until the mid-15th century. An ossuary bearing the inscription, Judas Thaddeus, was found alongside several unmarked ossuaries in Israel's Jezreel Valley. The site was dated to no later than the 2nd century, indicating that it could be Jude's burial place. Number 2. Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot's name only appears in the 4 lists of the apostles. Nobody knows what his nickname, the Zealot, means. One possibility is that he was a member of a Jewish sect called the Zealots, who were a revolution-seeking group in search of a Messiah. Another is that he was zealous about the study of Mosaic law or for Jesus and his teachings. Some early mistranslations of the Bible confuse Simon with Jesus' brother and inaccurately refer to him as Simon the Canaanite. This led to the belief that Simon the Zealot was present during Jesus' first miracle when he turned water into wine. But it's now thought that this may not have been the case. According to tradition, Simon preached in Egypt, but almost nothing else is known about him, and there are conflicting stories about how he died. The earliest records are from centuries after he died, which makes it even harder to say with any confidence what most likely happened. During the 5th century, the Armenian historian Moses of Turin wrote that Simon was martyred in the kingdom of Iberia. A compilation of the stories of saints' lives, known as the Golden Legend, claims that Simon the Zealot was martyred in Persia in 65 AD. Ethiopian Christians have said that he was killed in a central region of Israel called Samaria. One account says that Simon was crucified in Britain in 61 AD. Another story claims that he was sawn in half, while Eastern tradition holds that he died of old age in the ancient city of Odessa. Number 1. Judas Iscariot. The most famous or perhaps infamous apostle was Judas Iscariot. Even today, his name is synonymous with the word traitor. At one time, Judas was probably considered trustworthy. He was the designated treasurer for Jesus and the disciples. Yet, the same scripture that describes his job also mentions how untrustworthy he was. Jesus told his disciples at the Last Supper that he knew one of them was going to betray him. He then turned to Judas and said, "What you are about to do it quickly." At the time, none of the other apostles picked up on what that meant because they assumed Jesus was talking about something money-related. According to the Bible, Judas met with some priests and agreed to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He later approached Jesus while being followed by the armed mob who captured him and took him to be crucified. It is in this way that greed motivated Judas to do something that led to Jesus' death. He immediately regretted what he did, but his life was, in effect, ruined. According to the book of Matthew, Judas hanged himself. The Gospel of Luke describes how Judas used the money he received for betraying Jesus to buy a field where he fell head first. According to the scripture, his body burst open, and his intestines spilled out. It's not clear what this means, and both accounts were written after Judas's death, so it's possible that the writers got some of the details wrong. We often hear of the 12 apostles as a group, but it's fascinating learning more about each of them individually. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.